Bueno, kaixo danoi, ongi etorri, eta eskerrik asko etortzatik. Bienvenidos, bienvenidas. Bueno, creemos que hoy tenemos una iniciativa que puede ser bonita para cerrar el curso, ¿no? El cuatrimestre, porque, bueno, siempre tener una visión externa, salir de la visión única del profesor o de la profesora, ¿no? Y tener gente que trabaja en otros entornos, otras ciudades, otras universidades, siempre enriquecedor. Y sabemos que no es la mejor semana para hacer una ponencia y estar aquí como más tiempo de lo normal, porque estáis todos a tope, pero no ha habido otra manera y a ver si podemos aprovecharlo lo máximo posible. Entonces, la ponencia que tenemos hoy la hemos organizado desde la asignatura Urbanismo 1 de segundo curso, perdona. Y bueno, en este curso trabajamos el territorio y sobre todo queremos vincular los asentamientos humanos, tanto infraestructuras urbanas y demás, con las características del propio territorio y cómo se relacionan las dos y cómo modifican la una a la otra, qué impacto tienen la una en la otra, ¿no? De esto hemos hablado mucho durante este cuatrimestre. Y cuando nos propusieron venir, bueno, vimos que encajaba perfectamente lo que nos proponían. Ellos son Miguel, Eirik y Sabine online desde la Universidad de Oslo, ahora os los presenta Miguel. Y bueno, creemos que puede ser muy complementario lo que nos van a contar y lo que vamos a trabajar después en el workshop, en la asignatura, con lo que hemos hecho hasta ahora. Así que esperamos que disfrutéis de la ponencia y que después tengamos un taller intenso y motivador.
Una cosa que os comentamos y adelantamos, y tal vez no es tan común de hacer en la escuela, es bueno, que la presentación va a ser en inglés, porque, bueno, como es obvio, vienen de muchos kilómetros hacia el norte y tendremos que, bueno, tratar de... Yo creo que hoy en día más o menos todos estáis familiarizados de alguna u otra manera, porque tenemos todos los medios más o menos adaptados al inglés. Voy a comenzar con una presentación a ellos en inglés también y bueno, ya empezamos con esto y les damos paso a Miguel, a Sabine y Eirik. So, Sabine Müller is a professor of urbanism at the Institute of Urbanism and Landscape at the Oslo School of Architecture and Design. So she's an architect and an urban designer, right? Can you see? I can see you nodding. Yeah. And I'm also reading, because I need to make sure I'm reading the correct thing here. She is principal at the SMAQ, Architektur und Stadt in Berlin. And in Norway, she's been leading a series of courses on water and green infrastructure as a support for the urban development, framed under a long-term project called Oslo Hydropolis, which we translated here as Oslo Hydropolis. And then we'll have both Eirik and Miguel Hernández, who were former students of her course. Is that correct? Yeah. And you're currently assistant professors of urbanism and landscape at the Oslo School of Architecture. And you're both personally collaborating with Sabine in several different projects. And then, we've got here that Eirik is also founder of a small architecture practice called Speed Architects in Oslo. So hopefully you'll also be giving us an insight on your projects and work that you do there. So without further ado, Sabine, we just wanted to mention, this is something we were discussing before, that the topic is so relevant for us. We've had terrible floodings in the past few weeks. It's been raining for 4 weeks in a row, and we basically think it's such a relevant topic to speak about water, cities, and the territory. So thank you very much, and
all yours.
Okay, shall we get started?
Yep.
Okay. Well, thank you very, very much for the invitation. It is definitely really a pleasure to present our work here. Both Eirik and Miguel have been a significant part of this project, Hydropolis, that we are conducting already since 5 years in Oslo. And what I'll do, I'll present our work and the framework and ambitions, and also give a little bit of an idea of our, let's say, approaches in giving some glimpses on projects that have been developed within that framework. And then Miguel and Eirik will actually present two of the projects in more depth. So again, thank you very much. And I'll now share the screen. Start sharing. It's the usual question when you do video conferences. Can you see the screen and does it move? Okay, excellent. Okay, our topic is Oslo Hydropolis. What is a hydropolis? When we think of hydropolis, so meaning a city shaped by water, obviously the first thing that comes into our mind is Venice. Venice, a city basically being an island in a lagoon shaped by canals, and transportation basically working through the canals and so on. So when we think of city and water, we usually think of that close contact of a city to and its water. But, and this is very relevant, it's not only the city itself that we should understand as hydropolis. Let us have a look at these laws that were already made in 1600 in order to protect the city of Venice. And these don't depict Venice itself. They depict the so-called hinterland. The so-called Paulini codes for the Veneto look basically at the Alps and see and provide laws of how to protect the forest. That the mountains should not be deforested, because the consequences of deforestation is erosion, and therefore the cluttering of the rivers that lead into the sea, and therefore also the sedimentation of the very important lagoon that basically protects Venice from aggressors. So what we learn from these laws that were already pinned down in 1600 is that if we talk about a hydropolis, we don't talk simply about water in the city or its waterfronts, its rivers, and so on. But hydropolis is really an understanding of a whole territorial unit. And it includes not only water, but it includes, of course, also plants, forests, and the people that manage it. So that's very important. When we look at Oslo, one of the marketing rhymes is blue, green, and the city in between. And it's definitely what Oslo and the whole region is about. Oslo is situated at the Oslo Fjord, so that's the blue, and between the Oslo Fjord and the so-called Marka, which is the urban forest surrounding the city. It sits in between, and it's also penetrated by many, many, many water courses, small water courses that have shaped the territory for many, many thousands of years and are still shaping it. Yet, like in many cities, this, let's say, fine-grained network of water courses is not visible very much anymore these days. Many of the rivers have been piped in order to make in order to make land for buildable to be built upon, in order to have better roads and so on. So Oslo, also we should know, is the very specific, let's say, geography of Oslo. Its development, or the regional development, is very much shaped by the specific topography. So urban development and all the infrastructures really happen in the valleys, here depicted in gray. The white space mainly is forest areas. And we see that basically everything here comes together here in the valleys. Obviously, the valleys are full of water courses and of infrastructures, leading to some clashes that I think Eirik will talk about more. The dominant idea of how to develop the Oslo metropolitan area is through infrastructure, through better railway connections, and to connect the multiple cores of small towns and villages, here depicted in red on the left-hand side. What we propose through the project Oslo Hydropolis is to introduce another, let's say, another planning unit, which are the watersheds. I'll go into the question of what a watershed is in a second. So with this, and over the last years, we have basically made an inventory of all the watersheds that coin the Oslo metropolitan area. What you see already in this catalog is that each of the watersheds has also its own character, its own shape, its own, you could say, its own life. A watershed is basically a drainage area coined by the specific topography of an area. As we all know, water flows follows the laws of gravity. It flows down, and a watershed is that entity of a land which accumulates the water of a certain valley, basically. For ecologists, this has become a very important unit because one could say it's the flows of water that are so fundamental to the life or ecological life of a certain area, that one could say that if a watershed is managed properly, this will have extremely good benefits for ecology. And so here on the left-hand side, we see a diagram that we find very much, let's say, used in permaculture, claiming that we have to manage our watersheds in such way that we prevent erosion, that and we prevent that the water of a watershed just flows out of it. Therefore, the idea is to really retain the water within the watershed, keep the area moist, store as much water as possible within a watershed. So if we bring in this aspect of looking at a territory, we might come to an idea of planning that again looks at infrastructure, but it also includes the waterways as fundamental, as very nicely depicted here in the so-called Dutch layer model and the two-network strategy for ecological planning, where we have the so-called occupation layers, that is basically land use. We have the ground layers. These are geology, the soils, and so on. And hinged in between are the network layers, transportation infrastructure, hard infrastructure such as roads, electricity, but also the water networks. This is a bit the background of our approach to the Oslo Hydropolis. But let's have a look now at the challenges of this region. Speed Architects last year did a fantastic map in showing the let's say, enormous growth and development areas that is happening in the Oslo area. So gray is the existing context, and all the black areas are the areas where new residential areas are planned. Yeah. Oslo is definitely, let's say, if you see this little diagram here on the right, it's in Norway the center of growth, since it is the capital. Again, here an overview of let's say, the sprawling activities of urban growth. As we see, many of these areas are also situated in agricultural or forested areas. Quite problematic, you could say. On the other hand, we think of Scandinavia as a cool country, which a cool area in the world, and obviously this is also true, but climate change has long arrived in the Oslo area. So we can see over the last 50 years a rise of temperature of 1.5 degrees, and here a consequence of a heat wave in the last years, where basically all opportunities to go swimming are extremely crowded. With temperature change comes more rain. We have more floods, but there is also the issue of drought. So one of the big challenges in the Oslo area is to adapt to climate change. So the projects that we conduct within this framework is they really want to address the main challenges, which are, on the one hand, climate change adaptation, droughts, floods, storm burst, temperature and vegetation change, and loss of biodiversity. And at the same time, urbanization, growth, inequality, diversification of cultures, and also questions of participation. What we do is also to create an aesthetical knowledge through perception about place, its character, history, and evolution, and the intertwined role of humans in the environment beyond a nature and culture dichotomy. We like to crack the monoliths of nature, water, and city and look at this in a more nuanced way. So, for example, we have come to look at waters in terms of water traces. These are then, this is where water has left a trace in the territory and has shaped the territory. Here depicted in terms of territorial project as green. We look obviously as water as high and lows. So how to regulate the quantity of water, and some of the projects that we have developed are shown here in the territorial scale in blue. And then, of course, we could also claim that water has a taste. It can be fresh, it can be gray, it can be yellow or brown and black. So what kind, and these projects address mainly water quality. We work in a transscalar manner, connecting the territory with very concise projects. We try to foreground experiential dimensions and have come to make a recipe book related to the food that can be created or can be harvested with good water quality. And, oh, excuse the bad link here on the left side. And we explore the spatial dimensions of, let's say, a territory shaped by water and its plants. In the end, we are interested also in the figurative, meaning that we are looking for, let's say, territorial figures that give us guidelines of how to develop certain areas of the Oslo metropolitan area. So all of that is probably quite abstract now. So I'll give you a glimpse into facets and some guiding principles that we have developed through certain projects. So one of them is to connect daylighting of rivers with decentralized bodily experiences of bathing. This is a project that Eirik will talk about when I'm done, and it looks at how the practice of daylighting rivers can be connected to spaces of pleasure and bathing. We also think it's very important to sustain water supply or decentralized water supply while allowing for public access to the fjord. This is a theme that Miguel has been working on, so I won't go too much into his beautiful proposal right now, but rather have one glance at another project that's called Fjord Theatre in Hallandspollen, which is basically a so-called hytte or weekend house area in the Oslo metropolitan area. It's very interesting to acknowledge that these areas with weekend houses, they don't have a water supply, but since they become more and more inhabited also during the week, and people long for more comfort, questions are being brought up if water shouldn't be piped into these areas. Now, Oslo doesn't have much groundwater because of its specific geology. Freshwater resources are basically not so abundant unless you really take harvest rainwater and use it. But this is not a practice that is really done in the area. So the two students here proposed something extremely beautiful to, let's say, harvest and store water that would otherwise run down the hill, lead it along a contour, and create so-called water communities around decentralized water storage basins. At the same time, then, these waterways that run along contour are so easily walkable that they basically create a new access system to a quite privatized weekend house area, in which then becomes open to other visitors and hikers. Another facet is to promote rural water quality and therefore also the quality of food through rooms of productivity. In the map on the left-hand side, we see the water qualities mapped in the Oslo area. Red is for contaminated or polluted, and one of the main sources is agricultural activity, runoff from fertilizers, basically. Of course, a challenge here is also water supply, but the project that I will now look at deals with the water quality, with basically the water quality that we find in these millions and zillions of little streams in the forested areas and the rivers. It's the basket makery in Sagen Elva. And this abstract image shows basically a willow plantation along a river. And the clue, let's say, of that willow plantation is that on the one hand, it filtrates the agricultural runoff, so keeps the water of the river clean. And on the other hand, is the raw material to produce baskets. And here, the proposal is basically a basket makery situated at one of those small rivers in a valley. And it's the starting point for tours to be made into the forest with your newly made basket to harvest blueberries and canterelles or mushrooms. So here, this project brings in a way quite nicely together, let's say, the factors of water quality, so cleaning it, and the territorial dimension of water streams, plus leisure activities connected to those landscape values in the area. And beautiful enough, through the willows, they have fantastic colors. This becomes the project, the basket makery also becomes a spatial experience of wandering through different rooms of willows. Another aspect that we are looking for is to engage water heritage while facilitating spaces for a diversified urban society. As you might not know, and also many Norwegians don't know, is that ice exportation was one of the main products or economies in the 19th century. So in the Oslo area, many lakes were built, many dams were built really for the purpose of producing ice in the winter and then shipping it to London. So there are about 50 ice lakes in the Oslo area, always often located at the coast for transportation reasons, but then also some more for local usage in the forest areas. So the cutting of the ice was a winter activity for many farmers that did, of course, not do farming in the winter. Today, many of these ice lakes have a problem. Here you see again a day of drought or a season of drought. Connected also to a dam that needs repair, and it's not clear if people want, or the municipalities want to spend money on the preparation, on the repair of these ice lakes. Because one could argue those are man-made and should be rewilded again. So there is a huge discussion around this cultural heritage. This project, Gateway to Marke, takes a very interesting position in this discussion. Here we see an ice lake in the forest area connected to a satellite town and one family houses in the Oslo area. If we look at the lake itself, there are two interesting things that are worth looking at. You see it's a human product and has been shaped and changed its outline many times over the years. On the other hand, it's very interesting because a huge Hindu festival is taking place at that lake each year. So the former ice lake is being used for the ritual bathing ceremony of Norwegian Hindus. And what the project does is to provide, let's say, a better platform for the festival while redrawing the different stages of outlines of the ice lake. Since this lake has also problems of being full of water all the time, again, contour leads that bring water from the forest are created that lead the water into the water lake, while at the same time, again, providing that easy access into the forest and helping, let's say, cultures that are not so, let's say, familiar to hiking on steep mountains. They can use this network of channels and pathways, and therefore are basically invited to participate in the culture of using the forest. One more aspect that we like to look at is how can we, let's say, create landscape frameworks for new urban development. While the other projects that I was showing so far, they are more, let's say, individual interventions in a larger territory. Here, we want to understand better, let's say, the landscape conditions of a certain area that is meant to be developed for residential usages. We start with landscape descriptions, projecting, let's say, certain urban patterns onto the areas in questions, and see how then the main landscape features react to those urban figures. For example, again, you see here the hills and the valleys quite nicely in this, let's say, structural diagram, where basically the urban grid only can develop in the valley areas. What also plays a role then is, of course, layers of memory. So what does the landscape in question give us as a certain heritage and information about its history? And here's a proposal for a conversion of an airport in the Oslo area, which is coined by its long landing strip, which again could only be implemented here because it's a flat area. A flat area often is prone to flooding, of course, and so the whole landscape framework of this project develops around giving space for the streams that enter the valley areas, giving them room and area to infiltrate. Oh, again, bad quality of images. Here we see how really still we see quite nicely how actually water flows can really, let's say, convey the main figure of a plan, like in this proposal for the same area, where basically the let's say natural water flows that come with the specific microtype topography of the area are developed as vegetated areas, and it's then the mass of those vegetated areas that basically creates the public framework for the residential area. Looking at water, of course, it's so important to look at topography, and here's a beautiful project that develops the pattern of terraces in another area where basically it's the topographic section and the storing of water at each of the terraces that shapes or the ground for urban development. With water flows come also different ways of parcellation, and this project here shows how, let's say, different water, how the streams can be used as the guidelines for parceling up the area and providing for, let's say, fresh water for each of the parcels. Yes, I think I want to finish here. I'm probably already long over time and would like to ask now Miguel and Eirik to fill in and go a little bit more into depth with their specific projects.
This works. Thank you, Sabine.
Okay.
Can I see your presentations?
Yes, but then
okay.
we need...
Very good.
but we need, okay, let's just stop this a bit. Can we share? No, we need to become the, exactly. But does she need to make us... Ya ha dejado de compartir.
Tienes que darle a eso.
Pero ahora no podemos porque ahora ya no somos anfitrión.
Deberíais de poder.
A ver, espera un momento, que veamos.
¿Por qué no te deja?
Uno junto a otro. No, a ver. Sí.
No.
¿Cómo? Aquí.
No, pero...
Participantes. Porque ahora ella es la anfitriona.
A ver, pues dale a esto.
Aquí. Ah, vale.
Aquí, sí.
Sí.
Y
ahora sí.
A esto
Okay.
y supongo que sí.
Las tenemos que abrir. A ver. You start. Okay.
Okay.
Should we put it? Yes.
Okay, my name is Eirik. I'm a former student of Sabine, and now I'm teaching the same as Miguel at the School of Architecture and Design in Oslo. So I will present a project that is very much connected to what Sabine showed you. A student project from a few years ago that I did with a colleague of mine, which deals with the territorial scale of the river networks of Oslo, connected to the problem of urban flooding. So this is an aerial map of Oslo, which highlights the river networks, which are these figures. My area of interest was this particular river, which is called Alna, that runs through the eastern part of Oslo. And here is also the concept of the watershed that Sabine explained, that the river is actually part of a large system. So these figures, they show the outlines of this system. So what's very special of this Alna river is that it's a quite small area. So almost all of the river is actually located in the urban fabric in the city. And why is this interesting? That is because when it rains in the city, there is no place for the rain to go. It has to go down into the river. Compared to this system, there is a multitude of lakes and forested areas. Here, everything is located within the urban fabric. And if we zoom in, the reality is that this complex river system is, for the most part, put underground to make way for urban developments. And when you start to analyze this, you see that it's a very, very complex area with lots of highways, railways, metro lines, urban fabric, so there's really little space for the water, which is a problem, as we saw in Sabine's presentation, that we have to expect more heavy rainfalls, as I'm sure you're familiar with. So gives you situations like this, where the water is directly put underground into pipes to make way for these quite heavy infrastructures. And it also gives you situations like this. This is a neighborhood, quite new, recent development, at the very bottom of the valley. So this is actually the point where the river would naturally go. And even if the river is under a pipe, the rain will still gather in this area. So this is in Norwegian, but you can read 100 million. So it's a huge problem, and it's an expensive problem. So this was kind of the starting point. You have to do something about this flooding in the city. But then we kind of try to turn it on its head and say that more water in the city could also equal more swimming in the city. So we started to map out the areas, the problem areas of this urban neighborhoods. And the flooding problems obviously coincided with the areas where the river was put in pipes. And the river has been, for the most part, redirected into pipes which goes at the expense of the best flood protection, which is the natural river courses that can handle some variations in water level. So then the topic became river reopening, river daylighting, which is a very well-known topic. It's a relevant, important topic, and it is a strategy that is already in use in several places in Oslo. But it's not an easy or a cheap strategy. So our task was to add an element to this very technical strategy, and that was the idea of urban swimming. Is it possible to not only get better flood protection, but to combine this with urban swimming? So we reimagined this very complex urban fabric as a hydropolis, where what if the water lines became the most important infrastructure of the valley? And already here is, this could have been like the end of the project, because it's already such an important step to do this like radical reinterpretation of the territory, that it's not just a set of problems, it could actually be a utopian space for bathing. So we made this strategy which tackles the whole river system, where we work from the premise that each of the side streams in the river network is reopened, and where the river meets the main stream, this meeting is celebrated by a bath. And the main river is quite polluted due to industrial activity in the area. So these baths will get water from the sides, which can then be purified, so it's safe for bathing. So this was the territorial scale, where 36 baths evenly distributed along the river, where we also wanted to look at the architectural scale. So zoomed in on 6 of these baths to illustrate the strategy on another scale. So again, this is a technical problem, but how can you generate excitement with this and turn it into something more than problem solving? So we try to look at the characteristics of each space, so that these new baths became readings of the context, but also working in a coherent architectural language, so that they would become beacons along the river, connecting a quite fragmented urban area. So in this quite muddy clay slope, we imagined a mud bath which was just a super quick and intuitive design. So in one way, it's a very fun, simple idea, but then we also worked on the technical research, which is more in the background, where the water coming from the side stream is redirected. I can show it here. This is the side river going into the mainstream, and it's then redirected into pools of these wetland swamp plants, which actually can naturally purify the water. This is a known biological concept, so that the water that is redirected into this newly established bath is safe to swim in. So this bath becomes like an icon of the larger strategy, where this reopened stream leads you through this quite fragmented neighborhood, creating a new urban logic. So by reopening these small streams, you make these new connections in the urban area. And these paths lead you from the fjord and into the forest. So the reopening becomes like a linear park, connecting you to the neighborhood and creating new connections. Of course, this was maybe an easy area in this little slope. So what do you do in areas like this, where the infrastructure is so heavy and it's so present? So we had to also think in a dramatic scale and context, envisioning an Olympic pool between the railroad lines. Or other places, just minimal interventions, like a dam and a diving board. Or between the busy traffic, we imagined a completely introverted space, this hammam, steam bath, like an oasis in the noisy context. And this particular bath is located at the bottom of the valley. So here we actually suggest to lead the water from the side stream above the train tracks by means of this aqueduct, which also then emphasized that now water is given priority over the other infrastructures. And the general principle is to not intervene in the main river. Like I said, it's polluted, but it's actually also an important space for birds and some reptiles. So keeping a distance, sometimes the view is more powerful than actually going down and touching. So there are many projects planned in the area, including river reopenings. But this holistic approach that connects the entire area kind of acknowledges that if you do something in a river system high up, it will affect what's happening at the lower part. So you have to consider the whole system as one. So by working through these river structures one by one, imagining spaces for swimming, we transform this urban area of complex problems into a utopian space, and shifting this technical subject of water management into something fun, swimming. So in the end, the river system is connecting the fragmented urban structure, working on two scales, the territorial and the architectural, turning this part of Oslo into a hydropolis of different baths. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe we can switch places actually. What? I need to share here. I forgot this one. This one might not. Okay. So this project is located on the west side of Oslo, so it's a very different reality. Here it's one of the highest income areas of Oslo with a lot of private housing, and the problematic are very different. So it enters into this idea of an over-privatization of the coastline and a lack of public spaces by the water for the city. At the same time as it tackles the other problem related to water, which is the drought in the summer when there's not enough water to use in the garden, etc. So this is the mouth of Sandvikselva. This is, let's say, 30 minutes away from the city center of Oslo, which is located here. And here, the forces of geology shaped a very particular landscape in which you can easily see a pattern of parallel lines in the topography. These are the result of the folding of layers of sedimentary rocks that were later eroded by the ice of the glaciers. And this geological typology is the most continuous and well-preserved one in Norway, so it's a well-known site for geologists that come all over the world to study it. And it generates a very particular way of occupation of the land, mainly by smaller units. The cavities of this set of ridges and valleys is now filled by either soil or water. So you can perceive the effect of this geology, of these deep time forces, from the general landforms to this texture of the rocks in its many thousand beaches. In the past centuries, the area evolved from being a protected harbor with an economy based in quicklime production, fishing, and agriculture, to becoming one of the most exclusive and expensive areas of the fjord. Because of this strategic location, it's really close to Oslo, but also because of this natural appeal of these private spaces, small-scale beaches. It's the ideal place for these private grand villas with their own private boat houses, etc. So again, yeah, we had this large territory, but because of this fractal idea of the landscape, this concept, we focused the project on a strip of groups, of lines in this landscape, more specifically in this small archipelago that is a summer paradise of cabins and private piers. And here what we did is that we proposed a system that takes advantage of this micro-topography to collect water, modify the climate, and propose public spaces for the metropolis. As it's been said before, in the last year, Norway has experienced more and more dry summers, leading to droughts that have increased the pressure on the intake reservoirs. In the case of this island, around 80 million liters of water have to be pumped every year from the inland lakes. The soil layer is really thin, which means that you can't accumulate water in it, and at the same time you can't pump water from the aquifers because the water table is very small, the aquifer, so the saline water from the fjord would enter and destroy the ecology of the islands. And so to do that, there's this big infrastructural projects to bring more water from the inland lakes into the municipality to supply this growing demand of water. It is a very expensive and probably inefficient solution. So what we did is that we looked at the climate of Oslo, and in Oslo you have a very particular situation that is repeated in many places in the world. We could say it probably in the southern part of the Basque Country also, which is that you have a very wet season during the half of the year, and then a very dry season. So what we thought is, can we collect the water from the wet season and use it during the dry season? and in the case of this archipelago, where all the water that rains basically flows into the fjord. And then we looked at these agricultural techniques that was developed in the 70s in Australia by Yeoman to harvest water for agriculture. And this one uses the logics of the runoff, how the water flows on the surface, to dam it in this key point, this accumulation spot, which is where the slope goes from very steep to a bit more shallow, which means that with a very small dam, you can collect a lot of water. So a very minimal intervention makes a strong difference. And we designed this similar strategy that would make it possible to supply water to cover the demands of the island and to address the other main issue that concerned us, which was this privatization of the island, where you can see that the waterfront is almost all private, etc. So the idea was that these spaces where we would collect water could also become swimming spots and create a network of public spaces for open for everyone. In that sense, we would multiply the number of beaches and leisure spaces open to every inhabitant in Oslo. So yeah. At the same time, it could have swimming pools, fishing ponds, etc. Yeah. To design it, we looked at the history and landforms of the area, to the way landscape resources were and are still used. We identified this micro drainage pattern of the site, so this is how the water is flowing in a very small scale. As you can see, it's a lot of tiny little streams. And at the accumulation points, we calculated how much water could be collected in this surface. And at the same time, what was very interesting for us is that because of this very special geology, the shape of these lakes recreated or emphasized the geological aspect of the landscape and rendered it more visible for visitors more than just the geologists. And then we specified a design for one of them, a very specific one that was the public one. And here is where we'll talk a bit more about this later in the workshop, but this idea of our perception of aesthetics and interpretation of the site become important. And this is how all our interventions are aimed to structure this landscape, to reinforce this geology, to make these natural features of the landscape more visible and stronger. So this is how we imagine you enter the shelter space, you meandering the edge of the forest, or you see the apple trees, a pointy corner points to the water, how we could guide people into the fjord. And then you roll into this sunny beach where an infinity pool melts into the water with boats and kayaks, sail. And this bay opens to the concave bay on the other side of the water. There was this micro thinking of the topography, so the topography would naturally flow. The water would flow from here into the pool, so the water would go here through a sedimentation pool. So Sabine was saying how water always brings nutrients, etc. Here in Norway, there's a big problem because there's not enough nutrients and soil. So all the water runs here. All of these sediments that would fill the pools are stored here, and they can be used as fertilizer afterwards. Then they flow across this layer of fruit trees that have a different component, and then they flow into the pool, where again we have this type of macrophyte plants that are fixating pollutants, that is a very extended use now of plants to clean water so that people can swim in the pool. And then we played a bit with this idea of taking some of these rocks and using them to shape the space so that we could recreate this topography, this geology in a stronger way. Rendering this is those stripes that we're talking about on top of the site, how we inspire ourselves in that to create this space. Yes. Yeah, so this is a bit of an abstraction of how this geology become the different elements of the landscape intervention that we explain through this set of layers. So we have these drainage lines, then a small modification in the topography with these micro dams in some spots allows us to gather it, and then how we cut sometimes a bit the forest or grow it in other parts to emphasize this direction. We have a very monoculture forest here with only spruce and pine, and we consider to add all these edge species that increase the biodiversity at the same time as they modify the section, and then this furniture. Yes. Yeah. So for us, this was a way of recreating this fascinating geology and using it to define spaces. This is how we shaped the inland beaches of Sandvika that emerge from the existing relief of the landscape. In spring, the water from the rain and the thaw will fill the shallow pools where people will be able to swim when the deep waters of the fjord are still too cold because they are shallower, so they are warmer also than the fjord. So we can extend even this bathing holidays. While in the summer heat, these cool grooves will provide a fresh shelter to everyone that needs it. So this is a geologic plan of Oslo, and this is the west, so you see all these stripes. So this allowed us to see this intervention also as a large-scale intervention very easily because we had used the geology in such an active way. And this is when this idea of the 1,000 beaches comes. So these 1,000 public spaces in this privatized area that could serve the center of Oslo. These are the bathing spots that are not so many in this coastline. And then how well connected it is to the center of the city. And becomes this recreational network. Okay, that was it.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks to the three of you. Thanks, Sabine. Thanks, Eirik and Miguel. I think it was a brilliant presentation. It was so inspiring and also relevant for what our students are trying to do this year. And I think they'll all share my, hopefully, they all share my feeling that the material that was presented was also beautifully curated and nicely drawn. So thanks for that. I wonder if anyone has any questions. I'll start with a simple one because I could hear some of my colleagues who also had these doubts behind me. What's the status of these projects we're looking at? I mean, are they in any way being planned, developed, accepted, or is there any kind of future provision of potentially implementing these at an urban or metropolitan scale?
Sabine, could you hear? More or less.
No, not really. I couldn't.
Okay. No, they were. Mikkel was asking what was the state of the art with this project? If some of them are being developed, or yeah, this kind of question. So do you? Yeah.
Well, let's say like this. We use the framework of the school and the studios to develop these ideas. It's in a way it's a quite protected environment that allows us to really focus on the question of how to bring technical questions, planning questions and aspects of usage and pleasure into to really explore those. In the actual planning, this is not really yet implemented. As we know, there is a lot of river openings going on. But in terms of other water measures, the Oslo metropolitan area is still very much behind. So there is still a favor for big infrastructural projects, building new storage lakes of gigantic dimensions. So what I think is very necessary that we finally put all these projects into a book and start to distribute it.
Thank you. I mean, hello? I'm not sure you can hear me. No. Well, we'll have to translate. Hi, Sabine.
Hi.
Can you hear me now? Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah, so I also wanted to ask a couple more questions maybe, and hopefully if there's anyone around, we can share and even translate questions that other colleagues or students might have. Well, first things first, I think it's quite surprising for us to hear that in Oslo, in Norway, you have issues with water supply. It's such a complex matter for us to kind of process and understand. We really like the idea of approaching water not just as a technical issue and even giving importance to the figurative, to the perception, and even the memory you were talking in some of your presentations beyond the economic and purely technical aspects. We recently here, I mean, we do have some regional scale policies that have recently been implemented. We call them the regional planning guidelines here. The last dot, habrás escuchado, igual. And there's always references to the importance of kind of responding to climate, responding to climate change, the new conditions that are set by it. But always the focus is usually a defensive one. It's never a kind of, policy is never necessarily kind of reacting or working with the issues created by climate change, but actually working with it in a more defensive way. And by defensive, I mean creating these barriers you guys were talking about, that you were trying to open, also assuming potential growth of sea levels and how to react to it by potentially also protecting coastlines, etc. So it's so inspiring to learn how you guys are actually working in a different direction. And I wonder also how policies in Norway might actually implement, or what kind of policy tools you think might be used to kind of implement these kind of projects in the future.
Well, if I may say something here, it is, of course, quite difficult to think of policies already. I think we have to first think of, let's say, a different level, because policy comes last, you could say. First, there is the need for a different way of thinking, and one of the major problems is, of course, well, no, there are so many problems. One of the problems is, we have that in all the metropolitan areas, is that it's very difficult to form a metropolitan area that is composed of many municipalities. Right, and so the issue of water is something that goes beyond a municipality. Often it is a stream or a river that divides two municipalities. So it's the borderline. So that's why this issue of taking watersheds as a unit can be very important to, let's say, bring in a different administrative unit that unites different municipalities that are sitting on two sides of the same river. So that's one thing. Very difficult is, of course, the sectoral thinking. So water is a different administration than urban planning. And how to bring, let's say, and of course, traffic. So how to bring these sectorial divides onto one table. That's I think one of the biggest issues. So talking to the water administration, they will say when asked, so did you think of, let's say, social justice when you're opening the rivers? Like, no, that's not our competence. So it's extremely important to, let's say, create these round tables where the different layers of the territory are treated together. And then I think one of the main issues is, or one of the main challenges could be that we recognize that there will be much money needed in order to adapt to climate change. So this is like a new infrastructural revolution, you could say. We had, let's say, the piping of rivers, the creation of infrastructural networks, especially in the 50s, all over Europe, those were implemented. Many of these are old. They need to be renovated. And now it's the question if we are ready to take on that, to take the, let's say, money that is needed to basically adapt and to repair and use it for, let's say, a different kind of infrastructure. One that eventually doesn't create so much economic value in terms of giving big building companies a good contract, but rather, let's say, spreading those amounts of money needed into the communities and having it and working on more decentralized solution, because those will then also create a surplus for the life in the very localities. I think, let's say, all the projects that we are looking at try to exactly make that point.
Thank you. Is there?
Bueno, ¿alguien se anima a hacer una pregunta? ¿Tenéis dudas? O simplemente decir qué os ha parecido en inglés, en castellano. Si alguien se anima en euskera también, podemos traducir. No me esperaba yo muchas preguntas, de todas maneras. Pero pues igual podemos concluir, ¿no?
I think, yeah, we were trying to see if there's any other additional questions. We're going to be, we're looking forward for the workshop this afternoon. I'm sure it's going to be very useful and relevant for them. I mean, we've been looking at this idea of the watersheds as well as the valley as a unit. So one of the first exercises they had to develop this semester was actually defining the geographical boundaries within the administrative boundaries that we have defined by policy, etc. So it's something that kind of links very well to your lecture and these ideas you were trying to explain. But I think there was something very useful in all of your three presentations about the idea of bringing it down into the smaller scale as well. This idea of networks of micro dams and looking at it from not just the macro, but also zooming in and seeing the value of keeping this care and way of looking at water streams so delicately. I think that's one of the key values here. Also the idea of joy beyond the technical as a tool to potentially, almost educate people before, as you said, bringing in policies. So using it as a didactic tool. And I guess I really like the sentence you brought in your presentation, the crack the monoliths of urban nature, etc., so that we don't look at these topics as individual subjects, but try to kind of interlink between, well, basically look at them in a holistic way before approaching any of our projects. But I mean, it's been brilliant. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming. It's a shame you won't be able to join us for lunch.
That's really a shame.
But I'm sure they'll give you an idea of what we have and anyway.
Okay, then I really hope you have a great workshop, and let's stay in touch. Very curious to generate some exchanges on let's say, urban development through, let's say, an environmental lens.
Definitely. Thank you very much, Sabine.
Bueno, luego les tendremos en el workshop.
Bye, Eirik. Bye, Miguel. Talk to you soon.
Bye, bye.
Como os decíamos en el correo, haremos venir puntuales, ¿vale? Incluso un poco antes, porque haremos la entrega primero, la entrega de la práctica anterior, y nos organizamos en grupos para trabajar en, supongo que todo lo que habéis visto os inspirará también para después, y luego nos dirán lo que van a proponer, pero trabajaremos sobre el territorio y el agua en específico. Así que venid con ganas, ¿vale? Recordad que tenéis que leer el texto y traer los tres bolígrafos de 3 colores, rojo, negro, azul, ¿sí? Y ya está. Eso y un poco de energía. Hasta luego.